So, Kev, can you teach us the ideas and advice about being a mensch and anger and all sorts of other things?
Yeah. Okay. Here's a something else I just saw a few minutes before we went online. Okay. Silence is not always an admission. When a person is being verbally abused, especially in front of others, the natural tendency is to respond in self-defense. Remaining silent in the face of defamation or insult may be wrongly interpreted as admission of guilt. After all, the Gemara rules that in monetary disputes, silence is admission. Therefore, the Sefer Chinuch in Mitzvah 338 writes that under such circumstances one may respond, but only in a calm manner. He notes that there are righteous people who fear that any response, particularly to a false accusation, will arouse their anger, and therefore they opt to refrain from any response. And these are the people compared to the rising sun in its might. The Chofetz Chaim warns against drawing conclusions about the innocence or guilt of those who remain silent in the face of verbal abuse. There is no permission to believe Lashon Hora even if it is said in the face of the subject of the gossip. Even if he, the victim of the gossip, remains silent, it is not an indication that whatever is said is true. Even if that person is not usually silent in similar situations, his present silence may be a result of his desire to overcome his natural tendencies and avoid a quarrel. And that's in Hilchas Lashon Hora. Restraint insults, particularly those held in public, is not easily attained. But this type of restraint prevents quarrels and quells anger, all of which cause the destruction of civilization. Thus, the Gemara in Chulin 89a declares, the world would not exist but for he who restrains himself at the moment of contention. Mesilas Yesharim chapter 11 explains that this adage refers to one who has been humiliated, his anger aroused, and yet he finds the strength to remain silent and refrain from response, but he adds that a person should aspire to even more. However, the virtues of Hillel the elder surpassed all of the above, as he was oblivious to any insults, even arousal of anger never transpired with him. Well, I think most people are not on that level, and a certain individual who Damon knows told me
The Gemara cites the clause of the Mishnah that reads, if one stole an ox or sheep, and he consecrated it, and afterwards he slaughtered or sold it, etc. He pays the twofold payment, but he does not pay the fourfold or fivefold payment. Now, guys, I want you to see the difference between the Mishnah in the 74th daf compared to the 70th daf. Because the order in the 74th daf is he consecrated it, the thief consecrated it first, and then he slaughtered it afterwards. In the 70th daf, he slaughtered it and then he consecrated. That makes all the difference in the world. So if you consecrate it and afterwards you slaughter it, you pay the twofold payment but not pay the fourfold or fivefold payment. Now, why do you pay the twofold? Because a person is a thief. He shall pay double. But it's only if you slaughter or sell an ox or a sheep that you pay the fourfold or fivefold. So if you consecrate before the slaughtering, there's no fourfold or fivefold. So the Gemara is asking, it's understandable that the thief is not liable to the fivefold payment for the slaughter. For when he slaughtered the animal, it is the animal of Hekdesh that he is slaughtering, and not the animal of its original owner that he's slaughtering. Okay? Because the Mishnah, as Gavin quite rightly said, must refer to where the thief consecrated it only after a sufficient time was given for the original owner to despair of retrieving it. Because if he consecrated it before the owner's despair, the consecration would not take effect. Now, since the owner despaired, the temple treasury, which is Hekdesh, acquires the animal through Yeush, which is despair, and the change of domain. Remember, guys, there was two opinions. There was Yeush, which was despair, and some say that's enough. but the more stringent opinions say that you don't only need to spare, but also change of domain, effected by his consecration, because it went from the private domain of the original owner to the temple treasury. So when the thief slaughters the consecrated animal, it's no longer the animal of the original owner, and the thief cannot be held liable to the fourfold or fivefold payment for slaughtering it, only to pay double for the original theft. Okay? Now, there was that discussion there. I don't actually want to do a review back to that other stuff. Let's just move on to this current issue. So Gavin well remembered on both those points. And then we're going to get to the point soon now, which Kevin remembered. So you guys are doing well so far. But the Gemara is asking, let him be liable to the fivefold payment for the very consecration itself, meaning not the slaughter. Why? What's the argument? Because as Gavin did mention, Gavin, you were hinting to this idea, even though your wording wasn't correct. I knew what you were trying to say. What about the original consecration itself? Because what difference does it make to me whether he sells it to an ordinary person or whether he sells it to heaven? So basically, Rabbi Shimon is saying the following, is that he said, look, with respect to the fourfold or fivefold payment, giving the stolen animal away as a present to somebody is the same as selling it. It deprives the original owner of it. That's the bottom line. It's not like you can take it back from the thief to the original owner because it's one step removed now. So when the thief consecrates the animal, he is in effect giving it to Hekdesh. He should be liable to the fourfold or fivefold penalty, because what difference does it make whether the thief sold it or gave it to an ordinary person or sold it or gave it to Hekdesh? It's out of the thief's hands. And since it's one step removed, there should be a penalty, because now retrieving it is a nightmare. Okay, so well remembered, Gavin. Well remembered. Okay, so the Gemara answers, who's the Tana of this Mishnah? It's the Mishnah ordered by Rabbi Shimon, who says that a consecrated animal for which he bears responsibility stands in the possession of its owner. And both you and Kevin alluded to this fact. What are we talking about? A consecrated animal which the owner bears responsibilities. In this case, we're not talking about the original owner. It was stolen from him. But that's where there was a thief that stole an animal, and he says he's feeling very bad about it and says, listen, I want to make this statement. It's hereby incumbent upon me to bring an olah and then consecrate the stolen animal as an offering with which to fulfill my vow. So in that case, the thief is basically saying that if this goes missing for whatever reason, and the animal dies or is lost or is stolen, he's got a monetary interest in the animal because he has to bring another animal in its place. So since he's got an interest in the animal, he's considered the thief the legal owner. So accordingly, when one consecrates an animal as an offering for which he is personally liable, he retains some level of ownership in the animal. So by consecrating the animal under these conditions, the thief has not entirely given it to Hekdesh, and his consecration doesn't constitute a full-fledged gift that would make him liable to the fourfold or fivefold payment. Does that make sense, guys? So Rabbi Shimon is saying if somebody gives it under that premise that they're prepared to replace it if it goes wrong with their personal wealth, then Hekdesh doesn't really own it in its entirety. The person has a vested interest, and therefore the thief wouldn't pay a fourfold or fivefold payment, even according to the other opinions. So Rashi notes that although Hekdesh does not, according to Rabbi Shimon, acquire full title to the animal, and the animal retains, the original thief retains a right in the animal, the thief would still not be liable to the fourfold or fivefold payment for his subsequent slaughter of the stolen animal. Because what happens is there's another feature, according to Rashi, that's not mentioned in the Gemara, is that we learned in the 67th daf that consecration effects a name change in the animal. It was previously called chulin, because chulin are animals that you can partake in if shechted properly, and now it's called hekdesh, which it's not yours, it's the temple's. So when the thief consecrates the animal, the consecration takes effect through both despair and a change of name, as well as a change of ownership. And it's no longer the animal of the original owner. So either way, the thief is not liable to the fourfold or fivefold payment. When he subsequently slaughters it, since it's not the animal of the original owner that he's slaughtering. So it doesn't matter, no matter which way you look at it so far. Okay? So, but the Gemara has got an issue as far as this issue by Rabbi Shimon, this last issue. It says that a consecrated animal for which the thief bears responsibility by saying he will replace it if anything happens to it, stands in the possession of the thief. And therefore, since he retains a share in it, it's not considered as though he's selling or gifting the consecrated animal and then liable for the fourfold or fivefold payment. So the Gemara's got a problem with this, because from the fact of the ruling of the latter part of the Mishnah, it's stated explicitly in the name of Rabbi Shimon. Sorry, guys, I got a bit of heartburn. So what it's saying is that the second part of the Mishnah, which is in 74b, that reads, with respect to a consecrated animal, for which the thief in this case bears responsibility, he pays the fourfold or fivefold payment. But with respect to a consecrated animal for which he does not bear responsibility, he is exempt. So it's seeming to say the opposite way round. So the Gemara concedes that the first part of the Mishnah was obviously not authored by Rabbi Shimon. Otherwise, you don't have to say in the second portion of it, it's authored by Rabbi Shimon. And it basically suggests another reason why the thief wouldn't be liable to the fourfold or fivefold payment for selling the animal to Hegdesh, or even giving it to Hegdesh. Whether you sell it or give it, it's one step removed now from the thief. So rather, with what are we dealing here? And this is exactly what Kevin said, with where the thief consecrated the stolen animal as Kodashim Kalim. Because as Kevin quite rightly said, that there's two types of sacrificial offerings. The one is Kodshe Kodashim, which is the most holy offerings, such as a Chatas offering, an Olah, an Asham offering. And then you've got lesser offerings, or not lesser, they're lesser in holiness, called Kodashim Kalim. And that refers to Shalamim, Bechor, Pesach, and Maisa offerings. So in that particular case, if it's a Kodashim Kalim, which is a lesser offering, our Mishnah is in accordance with Rav Yossi Haglili, who said, if you remember, guys, in the 12th daf in Bet, that Kodashim Kalim, lesser offerings, are considered the property of the owner. Okay? What do we mean? Is that we learned a principle in that daf with respect to one who entrusted a Kodashim Kalim animal to a custodian. Okay? And he subsequently swore this custodian that he never got it, he never received it, and later he admitted to having sworn falsely. So Rav Yossi Haglili rules that the custodian must pay the principal and an additional 1/5 and bring an Asham offering as prescribed in Vayikra, Leviticus chapter 5, verse 21 to 26. Because one who swears falsely to deny a monetary claim of his fellow, etc., etc. So although the penalty applies only to a monetary claim of one's fellow and not a monetary claim of Hekdesh, it does apply to Kodashim Kalim. For Kodashim Kalim are actually considered the private possessions of the owner who consecrated them rather than Hekdesh. Okay? So therefore, we're saying the thief's consecration doesn't constitute an act of sale because they remain in his possession after he consecrated them. So, in other words, even Rashi notes that although the thief's consecration of the stolen animal is Kodashim Kalim, and it doesn't fully transfer into the domain of Hekdesh, which is obviously why he's not liable to the fourfold or fivefold payment for the sale, the Mishnah still rules that he's not liable for the subsequent slaughter of the consecrated animals. So we know as far as the slaughter is concerned, after it's consecrated, there's no liability. because he's slaughtering his own animal. But for the consecration, we're saying it could be like a sale, is that it's still one step removed from the original person, whether you sell it or give it away. Because the consecration, as Gavin said, if you waited for despair and a change of name and a change of location, change of name from Chulin to Hekdesh, okay, then the thief is not liable to the fourfold or fivefold payment which he subsequently slaughters, since it's not the original owner's animal. Now, just waiting for Arthur to come on. Just hang on, guys. Arthur, how long did you disappear for exactly?
No, it just was for 1 second.
Yeah, did you get a call? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I'm back there.
All right. So, guys, that's fairly clear. So, listen. So, Kevin, well remembered. So, the Gemara questions his answer of Rav Yossi Haglili. But if a thief had consecrated the stolen animal as Kodshe Kodashim, what would you contend the law would be? That indeed the thief pays the fourfold or fivefold payment on account of the consecration, which constitutes a sale or giving away to Hekdesh. That's what the proposal is. If so, then rather than teach the first segment of the Mishnah, if one stole an ox or sheep and slaughtered it and then consecrated the slaughtered animal, he pays the fourfold or fivefold payment, and then states as the contrast the case in which the consecration preceded the slaughter. Let the Mishnah differentiate and teach the distinction with respect to the case of the Mishnah's later segment itself, when the consecration preceded the slaughter, as follows. When are these things said in the latter segment? That if consecration preceded slaughter, the thief is not liable to the fourfold or fivefold payment. In a case where he consecrated the stolen animal as Kodashim Kalim, but in the case where he consecrated the stolen animal as Kodashim Kalim, he Kodashim, in other words, the highest level of sanctify, he does pay the fourfold or fivefold payment. That's what's suggested. But from the fact that the Mishnah doesn't make this distinction, guys, it's evident that even consecrating the animal as a Kodshe Kodashim, the highest level, it doesn't render the thief liable to the fourfold or fivefold payment for the sale if consecration occurs before the slaughter. So we can't resolve the difficulty with Rav Yossi Aglili. Okay, so what are we doing here is we're taking the Mishnah in the 74th daf and contrasting it with the Mishnah on the 70th daf. So basically, on the 70th daf, it states that if the thief is liable to the fourfold payment or fivefold, it basically occurs when the slaughter occurs first and then the consecration. But if it's a case where in the 74th daf, where the consecration occurs before the slaughter, that could not find any case of liability, whether it's Kodshim Kodashim or Kodshim Kalim. Yeah. So the Gemara is saying either way, why, you're not going to be able to answer it from Rav Yossi Aglili. So what you've got to bear in mind is a possible suggestion. The Gemara concedes that attributing this Mishnah to Rav Yossi Aglili, the first part, the latter part for sure, guys, is Rabbi Shimon. It doesn't resolve the difficulty. And the Gemara is now suggesting a different answer. Because either way, whether it's Kodshe Kodashim or Kodshe Kalim, if the consecration happens first, the thief is never liable for the full fivefold payment under the auspices of a sale or a gift, etc. Because already, as Gavin said, the despair took place, a change of location took place, a change of name took place from Chulin to Hekdesh. So for all those cases, it doesn't matter. In either case, the thief is not liable to the fourfold or fivefold payment where consecration takes place before slaughter. And regarding your difficulty as to what difference is there, whether he sells it to an ordinary person or to heaven, because originally Rabbi Shimon says, well, look, what's the difference if you give it to an ordinary person or you're selling it to an ordinary person, or you're giving it to heaven or you're selling it to heaven? Either way, the original owner is going to not get it back because it's one step removed. And he was suggesting that that's like a sale and that there should be a fourfold or fivefold payment. And that's where Rav Yossi Aglili's statement actually came in defense of that. But we're saying either way, we need to still answer that question. Since Rav Yossi Aglili, if consecration happens first with it, Kodshim Kalim or Kodshim Kadoshim, there's no four or fivefold payment if consecration happens before the slaughter. So we have to answer that difficulty. And regarding Rabbi Shimon's difficulty as to what's the difference, whether he sells it or gives it to an ordinary person, whether he sells or gives it to heaven, the Tana Kamma will answer as follows. When he sells it to an ordinary person, and Kevin remembered this aspect, by the way, well done, Kevin. Originally, before the sale, it was the ox of Ruvain, the seller. It might have been Gavin also mentioned it. And now after the sale, it's the ox of Shimon the buyer. But when one sells it to heaven, when he consecrates it, originally before the sale, it was the ox of Reuven, and now it's still the ox of Reuven. So what it's saying is quite simply as follows. If I sell my ox to Arthur, it starts off as Damon's Kabb's ox in the legal papers, and then it goes and it's transfer of sale where it becomes Arthur Tenowitz's ox in a sale. So it goes from buyer to seller. But if Arthur's giving money to Tzedakah, it was Arthur Tenowitz's money, and now it was donation given to the shul by Arthur Tenowitz. And therefore, it's still Arthur's in terms of attributable to his name. It doesn't matter whether he's still got it or not. It's a donation. And therefore, it's not the same as a sale where there's a change of ownership. Arthur, you keep going on the camera off. Are you with us, buddy?
Yes, I'm just lying here.
Okay, so just leave the camera on.
Yeah, I'll put it on in a second. I'll put the camera on there. You
Perfect.
see me now?
Love to see you. Cheers me up. Eyes watching all of you. All right, so that's fairly clear, guys. It makes sense. Well, that's a decent answer. Okay, so then the next point, the Gemara starts the final clause of the Mishnah, which reads, Rabbi Shimon says, etc., with respect to a consecrated animal for which the thief bears responsibility, because he's saying if it gets damaged, I'll replace it. I therefore declare that I'm giving this, you know what I mean? When he makes that whole shtick of the declaration, the thief pays a fourfold or fivefold payment. With respect to a consecrated animal, which he does not bear responsibility, he is exempt. Okay? Now, there's something wrong with the order of this. The reason why there's something wrong with the order is the Gemara is saying, okay, so granted Rabbi Shimon holds the argument, what difference does it make to me whether he sells it to an ordinary person or whether he sells it to heaven? And he therefore holds that the thief actually is liable to the fourfold or fivefold payment for the act of consecrating the stolen animal. But it's saying he should have said the opposite. If with respect to a consecrated animal where he bears responsibility, he's exempt from the fourfold or fivefold payment because the animal didn't go out of his possession. So you can't even consider it a sale then. If he said, if something happens, I'll replace it, because it's still technically his. So since he was willing to do a replacement, he maintains ownership of it, retains ownership, and therefore you can't consider it a sale. If you sell a car and you say if something happens to the car and it causes an accident, I'm still going to pay for the damages, you haven't truly sold the car. So it's the same thing here. If he says if anything happens to the animal and it gets consecrated, I'll replace it with another one. That's not truly a gift or a sale at all. So therefore, it's still his. But when he doesn't claim responsibility for the animal, he's then, according to Rabbi Shimon, liable to the fourfold or fivefold payment, because consecration takes the stolen animal out of his possession and into the possession of Hekdesh. So basically, guys, the Gemara understands at this point that Rabbi Shimon is disputing the Tana Kamma's preceding ruling that one who steals an animal and consecrates it and then slaughters it is exempt from the fourfold or fivefold payment. Because according to the Tana Kamma, is as long as there's despair from the original owner, change of location, and even the change of name, where it goes basically from Chulin to Hekdesh, etc., and it goes from the private domain of the person to the temple consecration, and Yush, where the original owner gave up, there's no four or fivefold payment. So the Rabbi Shimon says there is, but not if the original owner has a share in it. Still, because he's agreed to replace it, then it still remains his, because it's like he's responsible for the car if it has an accident. So, basically, Rabbi Shimon feels that there's no blanket exemption that and he still maintains that it depends on the type of consecration. If the thief consecrated the stolen animal as an offering for which he bears responsibility, he's liable to the fourfold or fivefold payment. And if he consecrated it as an offering for which he does not bear responsibility, he's not liable. Now, it can't be, that's what the Gemara is saying, possible that Rabbi Shimon holds him liable to the four or fivefold payment for slaughtering an animal after having consecrated it. Why? Because Rabbi Shimon, if you remember, holds that consecration takes effect. The animal is no longer that of the original owner, but of Hekdesh. So if he slaughters the animal, it's not the owner as the original animal that he's slaughtering, it belongs to Hekdesh. So Rabbi Shimon does must mean then that he's liable to the fourfold or fivefold payment for the act of consecration itself, at which he says it's like selling the animal or giving it as a gift. It's still removing it from the owner, and for that portion, not once you've already consecrated it, belongs to Hekdesh and you're slaughtering, but for the consecration itself. So he's disputing the Tana Kamma's position that consecration doesn't constitute an act of sale, because the animal is still called the offering of Ruvain. Rather, Rabbi Shimon maintains that consecration actually effects the transfer of legal ownership from the domain of the consecrated to the domain of Hekdesh. It does constitute an act of sale that carries the fourfold or fivefold penalty. And basically, the Gemara is switching the order. And because since Rabbi Shimon holds that Kodashim, for which one bears responsibility, are considered his private possessions, his consecration didn't take effect. A complete transfer of ownership out of his domain, and it can't be classified as a sale. So the Gemara is saying no. It's actually the other way around, where Shimon says there's a fourfold or fivefold payment if he bears responsibility. It's not the case. The Gemara is saying that if he bears responsibility, it's his as the original owner because he's prepared to replace it. Just like if somebody has an accident when they sell a car and they're still maintaining liability, they haven't truly sold it. So the Gemara is saying if he bears responsibility to replace it, if anything goes wrong, it's his. Then he doesn't owe a fourfold or fivefold payment. But if he doesn't promise to replace it with another animal if it goes wrong, he's given it to Hekdesh, at which case the Gemara is suggesting that's when Rabbi Shimon would say, technically, that a sale or gift has taken place and there'd be eligibility for a four or fivefold payment. Okay. So the Gemara is basically answering this question. And it says, they said Rabbi Shimon is referring not to the preceding ruling of the Tana Kamma. And guys, the preceding ruling of the Tana Kamma is where Rabbi Shimon actually agrees with that rabbinic opinion, that an act of consecration never constitutes an act of sale. Whether he consecrated the animal as an offering for where he bears responsibility or where he doesn't bear responsibility, the Gemara is clearing this up. Because after the consecration, it's still called the offering of Ruvain. There's no transfer of ownership to a new name. It's either Arthur's money or it's donated by Arthur, but it's still got Arthur as the title holder. of either the contribution or the monies in his account. It doesn't go from Reuven to Shimon. So he agrees with the Tana Kamma's ruling that the thief who steals an animal and consecrates it, obviously after sufficient time has passed where there's despair, Yush, and a change of ownership, and consecrates it and then slaughters it, cannot be held liable to the fourfold or fivefold payment. Neither for the consecration itself, because it doesn't really constitute a sale, nor for the subsequent slaughter, because after consecration it belongs to the temple, not the original owner. But it says there that Rabbi Shimon is disagreeing with a different matter with the Tana Kamma. And that is that if a thief steals an ox or sheep and a second thief steals the animal from him, the second thief is not liable to the twofold payment for his theft, nor for the fourfold or fivefold payment should he subsequently slaughter or sell the stolen animal. Because the Mishnah is saying, we learned in the Mishnah above, and if you remember, that was in 62b, I had to just check the reference, one who steals after a thief does not pay the twofold payment, nor does one who slaughters or sells after a thief the fourfold or fivefold payment. So it's saying that if a thief steals an ox or a sheep, and then there's a second thief that steals the animal from him, the second thief isn't liable to any of the penalties, not the twofold, fourfold, or fivefold. He just has to give back the principal to the original thief, and the thief has to pay double. And if he subsequently slaughtered the animal, and the second thief takes the slaughtering of the animal, the original thief has to pay the fourfold to the original owner, and the second thief only pays the principal. So that's the issue where Rab Shimon is disagreeing. So he said, and similarly, one who steals a consecrated animal from the house of its owner and subsequently slaughters or sells it is exempt. What's the reason? For it states with respect to the fines imposed on a thief, and it was stolen from the house of the man, which implies but not from the house of Hekdesh. So it's in regard to this that Rabbi Shimon says in our Mishnah, for if one sells and slaughters or sells a consecrated animal for which the owner bears responsibility, he is liable to the fourfold or fivefold payment. So what we're basically saying is, if you look at Shemot chapter 22, verse 6, it talks about that a thief is liable to the twofold penalty for theft and the four or fivefold penalty for the slaughter or sale of the animal, only when it's stolen from the house of the man, meaning the original owner, but not, which is a private person, but not when the animal is stolen from Hekdesh, which is the temple grounds. So this Tana maintains that all consecrated animals, whether or not the owner bears responsibility for them, meaning that the original owner said he would replace it or not, are the property of Hekdesh and not the property of the owner who consecrated them. So the thief who steals Kodashim is not liable to the twofold payment for the theft, nor for the four or fivefold. Okay? Because the Mishnah had a first law that one who steals from a thief is not liable to the twofold, fourfold, or fivefold. And it also implies that it has to be stolen from the house of the man. Okay? But this is the issue that Rabbi Shimon and the Tana Kamma disagree with, because Rabbi Shimon maintains that since the owner bears responsibility for the animal, the original one, he's actually suffered a loss. Whether it was the in the event that it dies or becomes stolen. So it's considered his personal property, even if he already donated it to the temple. So whether it was the thief or the original owner, if he said that if anything happens, he'll replace it, then the second thief has to make that payment, because it's not like he stole it from the temple grounds compared to a private person. Because now the private person is going to lose money. It's not just the temple. Okay. So, for it was stated with respect to the fines imposed on a thief, and it was stolen from the house of the man, but not from the house of Hekdesh. It is in this regard that Rabbi Shimon says in our Mishnah, If one steals and slaughters or sells a consecrated animal for which the owner bears responsibility, he's liable to the fourfold or fivefold payment. But the Tana Kamma says not. What's the reason Rabbi Shimon holds him liable? Because we can apply it in the verse, and it was stolen from the house of the man. Because the person said that if anything happened to this hekdesh consecrated animal, he would replace it. So therefore it does affect him, not just hekdesh. But if one steals and slaughters or sells a consecrated animal for which the owner does not bear responsibility, the thief is exempt, even the second thief. But we can't apply it in the verse, and it was stolen from the house of the man, because it's hekdesh's problem. Okay, guys, there's 5 minutes left. I'm quite happy to end off.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Sorry. Sorry, I just had a bad connection for a small part, and it wasn't really repeated. Just if did you say that a person can slaughter the animal and then give it for what's it called?
Consecration.
Consecration. Can you slaughter it and then give it for consecration? And then what's the implication?
No, so the implication is in 70 is that if you slaughter it first and then you consecrate it.
How do you do that firstly? In practice, how do you do that? Surely you give a live animal so they can put it up. I've lost signal with you.
Gavin, can you see me?
Yeah, I can see you now. So it's clear now. So I've got a bad connection tonight. Yeah, I can hear you now. And
honestly, I have no idea how the temple process works. The only thing you've got to bear in mind is if the slaughtering takes place before the consecration, there are cases where there's liability. Okay, but if consecration happens first, before the slaughter, there are no cases of responsibility, because originally they wanted to pin it on gifting, and gifting is like a sale. The original owner loses it because it's one step removed from the thief now. You can't take it back from the thief. But we're saying any time that the thief consecrates it, the original owner isn't liable, because once it goes to hekdesh, then if it's slaughtered afterwards, it belongs to hekdesh. It doesn't belong to the original owner. If slaughtering happens first, there is liability, but not in all cases. There's liability if there isn't Jewish and a change of domain. In other words, if the slaughtering happens and the original owner hasn't given up hope of finding it, and it hasn't been slaughtered in the temple courtyard, then in that particular case, it hasn't had a change of location either. So there are stringent opinions that said that also needs to take effect, not just Jewish. Do you get what I'm saying? So it's pretty straightforward. I've got my smecha. I put Arthur to sleep, bless him. And, okay, still awake. Thank God. Guys, you had not a bad memory. I thought this was important. And now it's all clear.
Yeah, thanks. Sorry, I slept a bit yesterday, so I didn't. My memory wasn't.
Yeah, but this wasn't a waste to redo it, Gavin.
No, I appreciate it. I needed it. Sorry, I really needed it. Thank you.
All right. Even it was good to learn it. Guys, have a wonderful evening. God bless.
You too.